The study on the lived experiences of female ministers is conclusive. Male leaders are the key to narrowing the gap between egalitarian theology and its praxis. In other words, since men mostly occupy top leadership, God has uniquely positioned them to cultivate a gender-inclusive leadership culture that mirrors His world, vision, and heart. Then, how do successful male champions walk the talk? Let's learn from those that are doing it right. Hi, I'm your host, Sehi Duran, and welcome to Better Together podcast, a place for honest and gracious conversations for all co-laborers in Christ. Whether you're a husband, a father, a mentor, or a ministry leader, your championing voice matters to women called to ministry. Thanks for making a difference. If you haven't followed our podcast just yet, there are 3 episodes prior to this episode that we have covered 3 different topics. The first one, we talked about why male champions matter. In that episode, we talked about the age position, egalitarian theology, and some biblical examples of female leaders and male champions. And in the second episode, we talked about what male allies need to know. So we talked about the myths about women in leadership and some of the common barriers and challenges that women face every day and how men can come in to make a tangible difference to break that barriers. And then the third episode, we talked about problem solving. Guys, we have some work to do. We have some things to fix. And this is where you come in. And we talked about teaming model, TEAMING model, training, empowering, advocating, affirming, and mentoring, and ing suffix. That's just to relate to about ongoing journey of leadership development and how important it is. And so we also talked about how some of the characteristics of male champions and what are those common characteristics. Well, today I have 2 guests who meet those characteristics. And in fact, these 2 individuals that you're about to meet are 2 of many male allies and ministers in the Assemblies of God who participate in the survey for male champions. So these are the guys that are doing the work. They're not just talking the talk, but they are walking the talk. So let's introduce Pastor Gene Roncone from Rocky Mountain District Ministry Network and Pastor Don Ross from Northwest Ministry Network. Hello, pastors. How are you doing?
Hello. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, first of all, for being part of the Network of Ministry, Ministers' Life already. I remember back in when we did a leadership conference, you were the only 2 men who actually came and spoke life into the district leaders of the Network of Ministers. So it just means so much to see you guys here. And today we're going to tackle some questions that are a little bit challenging and difficult, but I know that you have some answers. So are you guys ready for that?
Yeah.
Good to go.
All right, good to go. So according to the survey I conducted for male champions for women ministers, a likely male advocate or ally for women in ministry is an ordained district leader or local pastor in the age groups of 50s or 60s with a graduate or postgraduate degree who had an early exposure to female leaders and is married to a wife who leads outside the home. Well, that's a mouthful, right? But do you fit that category, first of all? And do you think these visible examples of female leaders in personal life influence how men normalize female leadership elsewhere? Pastor Gene, why don't you start with answering first?
Yeah, when I hear your portfolio, I'm guilty as charged. I mean, a number of things gave me, I think, confidence to value female leaders. I grew up in a single parent family. My mother was 27, raising 3 kids on her own. My grandmother from my dad's side was an Italian immigrant who became a single mom who raised 3 boys and did an incredibly successful job putting them through college. My older sister, when we were in a single parent family, my mom wasn't employed. I remember my sister was, I think, 15, got a job in a restaurant and supported the family. And my Italian grandmother, or both my grandmothers were immigrants who were gritty and intelligent and determined females who really believed in me when I was caught in a life of drugs and alcohol. So I think I would agree with that. I think that when we see females that are independent, successful, and gritty, it makes others, it made me willing to imagine female leaders, to accept female leaders, and even to follow them. So I would agree with that.
Oh, that's great. How about you, Pastor Don?
Well, I also am guilty as charged. My mother had a significant influence in my life. My father is a pastor. My grandfather is a pastor. We've traced our history back over 200 years to when we immigrated from Scotland. We have pastors through our entire lineage. So I was kind of born into it, although there was a specific call in my life. That being said, my wife also has a very distinct leadership gift. She has not always used it in the church. She used it also in a public school setting and also in a Christian school setting, but she definitely has a leadership gift. So I found myself surrounded. And I think as I shared in Branson, I was a little bit surprised to learn after coming to this role as a network leader that anybody actually resisted women in leadership. I was a little bit caught off guard by that. So I had to do a quick study and get my foundation in line.
Wow, that's fascinating. So do you both have a daughter, or at least one daughter?
Yeah, I have 3 daughters and 1 son. So yes, I do.
Okay, how about you, Pastor Don?
I have 2 daughters and a son. My daughters are the oldest. My son is the last. My oldest daughter married a Japanese man. We hosted students for 20 years from all over the world, and had over 100 of them. Number 6 became my son-in-law. I was a little nervous that we might move to Japan, but he actually came to Christ, was discipled, and now he's an elder in our church.
Wow.
And my second daughter is married to my pastor, who was my executive pastor for 10 years and then took the church over when I came to the network office.
That's fascinating. The reason why I'm asking that is because that was another factor. That male leaders in all those characteristics that I just mentioned above, right, who has a daughter, also tends to be a male champion. It's just natural for them to champion. Because I think it makes sense, right? You have a daughter, you want the best for your daughters, biological daughters, you want the best for your spiritual daughters, and any woman called to leadership in ministry. So yeah, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? So thank you for that answer. Here's the second question. The survey outcomes also indicated that the best setting for cross-gender mentoring is monthly small groups meetings in which both personal connection and accountability can coexist for ongoing conversations and collaborations for developing quality leaders. But as you know, high-level leaders have busy schedules and can't mentor everyone. So how do you identify the right mentees, and how do you practically train or mentor women called to ministry in ways that are mutually edifying, honoring, and transparent? Let's start with Pastor Don, and I'll go to Pastor Jean.
Sure. I'll tell you what I do and then the story of how it came about. I have a monthly Zoom call with anywhere from 12 to 30 women who are called to be lead pastors or have a desire to be a lead pastor. And I've had a coaching network for well over a dozen years. And so I just took that information and just transferred it over to them. Interestingly enough, about the first 3 sessions, we talked about women in leadership because I had to get that around my head. And then after that, we just talk about leadership. And seriously, I forget that I'm talking to women in the middle of that coaching. It makes no difference what gender they are because the leadership issues remain the same. And the way that this came about is one of the star women leaders in our network, Beth Backus, amazing. Dr. Backus is planting a church now, but about a year or so ago, she was invited by a church to present her resume, which would infer that there would at least be a follow-up conversation, at least a call or a letter, and nothing happened. And I actually, I have to confess, I was angry about the way that church treated her. And I came home and was confessing to my wife, who's certainly not shy, but careful about what she says. And she leaned forward and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And I said, "Well, honey, what can I do?" And she got her pointing finger out and she said, "What are you going to do about this? You are the network leader." And I said, what can I do? Each church is autonomous. She said, "You are the network leader. What are you going to do about it?" And so I pushed back and said, "What about the bylaws and one thing?" And she just wouldn't have any of it. She said, "You are the network leader. You must take initiative." And I said, "Okay, I will at least pray about that." And so I actually caucused with some of the key women leaders in our network. And and said, what do you think about this idea of a women's leadership cohort focused on women as lead pastors? And they said, we love that. One of the other things that we've noticed that you might find interesting is when we appoint an individual, and it could be a rural leader or a female leader or an ethnic leader, either as an area leader presbyter or a regional leader executive presbyter, it takes about a decade before the culture in our network has shifted until they are voted in on their own. We now have women on our executive presbytery and many women on our network presbytery. Altogether, we've got pretty close to 50 presbyters when we all gather. And we have pretty close to a half a dozen women, all have been elected except for 2, which I find incredibly wonderful that our network has shifted in that way. So now we are naturally seeing ethnic leaders elected, women leaders elected, and I like that kind of shift. I think that's more like New Testament.
Wow, that's so powerful. And what I'm also hearing this is like, in our conversation, it feels like the women in ministry leadership and empowering women called to leadership, it's like a recent conversation, but listening to you, it's not a recent conversation. I mean, you've been doing this for decades. So thank you so much for doing this even before we started to have this public conversation. And what is your wife's name?
My wife's name is Brenda. And I should also mention, I had an executive pastor who served with me before my son-in-law for 10 years, who was a woman.
Wow. Brenda, thank you so much for holding your husband accountable. The leader, you are uniquely positioned at that level to make a difference. So thank you for allowing this conversation to happen and accepting your wife's advice. That's really, really powerful. How about you, Pastor Gene?
Man, I love that story. My journey was a little different in that I've been a superintendent. I'm going on 3 years here in a couple months. And I was, like Don, surprised. I had females on my staff pastoring and on my board. But when I was elected superintendent, we did not have one female on a committee, on the presbytery, on any format. So we had a lot of ground to cover in 3 years. And, we're proud today that we've come a long way. We have female executive presbyters. We have female presbyters, females on every one of our committee. And those have all been through elected by their peers. There were 0 appointments. So that journey started that way for me. As far as how I pick them, I mean, that's the tough thing, because you hit the nail on the head. We don't have time. And mentoring is a labor of love. It takes time and patience and money. And I just don't like wasting those 3 things. Not everybody who wants a mentor is ready for one. And your organizational momentum could be pulled back by having too many people that you're mentoring, because it distracts your focus. So there's a few things in answering to your question. How do I determine? There's lots of ways that we pull our females in and mentor them. My primary way is I have a cohort every year I do once a week where we train sharp young associates to be lead pastors. And we go in and we teach them things that they never learn until they're a lead pastor. And so that has been huge for us, because a lot of our churches who are looking for staff are waiting for that cohort to end, and they kind of see that as a farm league. So that's been very, very helpful for us. Now, how I pick those, boy, that's tough. I look for promising leaders. I wouldn't say promising females. I look for promising leaders. And there's this one verse that I love, when God told Moses that he wasn't going to be able to go to the promised land. And he said, take Joshua, son of man, of whom the spirit of leadership is, and lay your hand upon him. And so, man, I mean, what is that, the spirit of leadership? Scholars are a little uncertain as to what it means, but the context lends itself to things that I have adopted. I look for female leaders that have a history of faithfulness. Joshua was proven in many areas of leadership. Everything that he was tasked to do, everything he was charged to do, he was faithful. I look for successful followership, and this kind of may sound strange, but I think the key to being a great leader is to have some point in your career, your leadership journey, you have been a great follower. And that's really important to me. So when someone has been a great follower, it proves that they can be loyal to something greater than themselves. And to me, that's how you guard yourself against a narcissist who becomes a leader. So not all followers are leaders, but I think all outstanding leaders have been great followers. I think proven results are very, very important as well. I think in our day, we live in this culture that is infatuated with optics. We hear it on American Idol, you look the part, you look the part. And I need people to invest in that more than look the part. I need people that have results behind them and not just optics. So for me, in my cohort, it's a ton of time. I spend 2 to 3 hours a week prepping. I bring in guests. We invest a lot of money. The network does in that cohort. It's long. So I want to pour into female leaders who have proven themselves. And that's important to me. I think the last area is what I would call divine giftings. I love that phrase, Sehi, the spirit of leadership. Scholars debate on what that means. There's basically 2 different camps, and one camp means that God gave him courage to lead. The other camp believes that means God-given leadership ability. I tend to wonder if it's both. And so I look for female leaders that have both of those. And those are the people that I'm willing to take risks on, and look for what I call triple scenarios of win, win, win. I want them to win. I want myself to win. I want the network to be better because of that investment. So we do that through Zoom cohorts, through collaborative projects, writing projects. We do that through giving them opportunities to win on a network stage and one-on-one access to me. So that's kind of how I try to navigate that.
I like that, win-win, and that's supposed to be, right? Because it's all about God's kingdom. It's not about male ministers. It's not about women ministers. It's about servants of the Lord, which you both kind of mentioned that we're just talking about ministry leadership, not about female ministers. I think there was a time that it was necessary, and I think it's also inspiring for us to hear people like you in the position of authority as superintendents of ministry networks and districts to say that, like we're ready to disciple and invest and mentor and train ministers, period, right?
And I think what's powerful is, that triple win is the one that convinces everybody. It's great when they have a win because you've invested in them. It's great when I have a win, but when you have a committee that just crushed dealing with the moral issue because of 2 amazing female leaders on that committee, that's when everybody says, man, we need more of what we're seeing. So I think that triple win is the goal.
That's great. And it takes men like you in the top leadership to continue to communicate that and advocate it, affirm it, and normalize it. So you guys are doing it already fabulously. So thank you for doing that and making a difference. Here's my third question. The AG has been supporting women since its founding in 1914. You both know that. We credential women before they earned their right to vote in America in 1920. But there is a large gap still between egalitarian theology, which is our age position, affirmed by position paper and the bylaws. But there's a gap between that and the practice. Some say we're not walking the talk. So how can we narrow this gap more efficiently? So what practical advice do you have for both male and female ministers who struggle to fully embody this egalitarian ministry leadership? Pastor Gene.
That's a great question. And for one, I think that we are further along than we really realize. I think the biggest, strongest obstacles are gone. I think it's time to run in. And so there's a number of things that I think female leaders can do and male leaders can do. Male leaders need to intentionally mentor female leaders much more than they are. Not that female mentors, there's amazing female mentors, but we need both genders mentoring each other. I think females have to seek out male mentors. There's nothing that gives you credibility more than being mentored by someone who is already respected, who already has results, and who is already seen as a leader. I think another thing that's important is advancing their credential. When I did my own research for an article that I worked on, I was shocked to find that 60% of females are not ordained. So I'd like to see our female leaders really own advancement and become ordained. I think gaining practical experience, senior pastors experience, leading boards. I think things like collaborating, things like dealing with diverse constituencies. You can't be an activist as a lead pastor today. You have to be a moderate. You have to lead your organization and build consensus. So anything that gives you those skills are important. And lastly, I would say results that facilitate advancement. Dawn gave an illustration that was the perfect illustration about Dr. Beth Backus. Beth is an amazing leader. Sehi, you are an amazing leader. I'm not saying you're an amazing female, you're an amazing leader. When I walk away from interactions with both of you, I think, now that is a great leader, not that's a male or a female. And I think it's because both of you have had results. And I think results, effectiveness, and being a good steward of the ministries that you have go a long, long way. Those are the biggest allies for advancement.
So I think it's very interesting, Pastor Gene, that you said that, because in my research, I also found out that male leaders who affirm the calling, like leadership calling first before gender, is more effective in their training and mentoring practices. So I don't know if you're doing it on purpose or it's just natural to you, but whatever you're doing, it's working and it's the right thing to do. So thank you for doing that. Pastor Don, I'm going to pass the mic to you. And how can we narrow this gap between egalitarian theology and practices? What are some of the things that worked out for you?
Well, you're exactly right. There is a gap, and it's historic. If you go back to the first couple of decades of the Assemblies of God, you saw many more prominent women, both pastoring and in missions. And there really wasn't much of a conversation. It seemed like they were accepting either way. But over the decades, especially since the 60s, our fellowship has become constitutionally accepting, but culturally resistant. I'm not exactly sure why that is. To some degree, it's a bit of the rise of Reformed theology I don't need to even mention any names. I think we all know who we're talking about, but they've come out very strongly. And I will tell you that I have leaders in my own network that embrace some of that position, even on my own presbytery that have been elected. I do not make that an issue. So here are 4 considerations. First of all, I tell women, do not wait for someone else to open the door for you. Jesus has called you, go, do it. It's like the parable of the man who went to hire workers into a field. Some early in the day, some later on, they were standing around waiting. And that's what I feel like sometimes when I'm with women, and this is not a woman thing, it's a human thing. Sometimes we feel like victims. Our hands are tied, we're trapped, we can't do anything. And actually, that's a lie from the enemy. If Jesus has called us, there is something we can do. I don't care if you're sweeping the floor in the church, handing out programs, teaching a Sunday school class, do something to make yourself useful in the kingdom. That's very, very significant. We're in the process of electing an assistant superintendent. And out of 108 nominations, we filed that down to the final 7 candidates, 3 of whom were women. I was very, very proud of our network for seeing the value of that. So that tells me that our culture is continuing to shift, okay? The second thing is don't try and change people's minds. If they are complementarian, let them go. A man convinced or a woman convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. I'm not going to waste my time on that. I'm not going to try and convince pastors that they should plant churches. I don't try and convince atheists that they should be Christians. I answer the questions that I love them, and I approach it from a truthful point of view. So I do not waste any time on these arguments. I'll answer honest questions from people that are searching, but I will not be involved in an argument. The third thing is I think we need to address this at the board level. And that's where superintendents must carry the water. We've got to run the ball on this, because a board that will not at least have a conversation with a woman leader will never understand what could happen or what they're missing. So I will have individual conversations with board chairman or pulpit committee chairman and say, have you considered such and such? And I won't even say a woman. I'll just name the person who's highly qualified. and ask them, would you be willing to at least have a conversation? Well, I don't think our church is ready. I understand you're not ready to hire, but certainly you can have a conversation. Well, I don't know. Well, why not? Why not? Can I remind you that when Jesus' disciples ran, the women ran towards him when the disciples ran away. So let's not ignore the impact that women have had on Christianity throughout the time. And then finally, I've made a decision, as long as I am in office, we will have a woman speak at Network Conference every single year. Every year. This year we have Donna Barrett. Next year we have a church planter, Adelita Garza, who will be coming out. I will make sure, I made that commitment. We now have 1/3 of our credentialed ministers in our network. We have about 1,400 ministers. 1/3 of them, 28%, not quite a third, are women. This morning, I listened to a podcast of a pastor's wife who's not credentialed. And I already have a letter in the mail to her saying, what you did was amazing. I want you on our team. If you're willing to take steps, we'd like to put you into the pipeline of credentialing to at least explore that. And I hope that she will do that. So I am constantly scouting, and I'm asking my leaders to do the very same thing.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is that it doesn't happen if you just sit there and let it be. I think you both are leveraging your God-given responsibility and position of influence and voice to empower both men and women to live up to that calling. So it won't happen just by default. It would happen because you're intentionally championing that. And so thank you so much. And so here's my final thought.
Let me say one more thing.
Sure.
Let me say one more thing. This is not a gender thing. This is not a culture thing. This is a Bible thing.
Yes.
Dr. Wally Kowalski, who sits on the theological committee for our fellowship, has done 4 videos that we keep and send out to any pastor or any board that has questions. And it is impossible to listen to his exegesis of the scripture and come away without believing that God will not leave 50% of his workforce on the bench.
That is so true. And based on my research too, everything starts with sound theology. So AG, we stand on egalitarian theology. So we got to teach our young people at a local level. So pastors, your ministry leaders, youth pastors, children's pastors, we have some huge responsibility that we're carrying. We have the responsibility to teach the right theology because it starts there. And our actions have to match that. And you're also talking about visibility of female leaders. That's another thing that I found out in my research, and how male allies, they're very intentional about putting, like you said, Pastor Don, intentionally putting that visibility in there. Not just any random woman, of course, qualified, like Pastor Jean said, proven with track records, right? So you know those people through your network, through your relationship. You're not just getting referrals, right? But you know these people individually, and when you know their qualities and their skills and experiences, you're going to recommend their names. So you're doing exactly what I discovered in my research, and you are the living example. So you are doing it, so it's possible to replicate and duplicate. So here's my final thoughts. You have so much experiences in developing and working with leaders, and in regarding gender inclusive ministerial leadership or cross-gender mentoring. What are some of the cool tips? What are some of the practical tips that you are using today that you enjoy in growing in? Pastor Don.
Well, I think just hanging around women leaders, I can't encourage other leaders to hang around them if I don't do that. And so I know there's the Billy Graham rule, et cetera, but I remember as a local pastor, I would take my guys out for lunch, and I very rarely I would never actually go out to lunch with the women who are on my team alone, but I can find a way. If they need to talk with me in private, that's fine. That's what I have an office for. My secretary knows that I'm in there. Everything is done above board. But on those random casual times, it's important that they not be excluded. Find a way, build a bridge, make it happen. Because if we don't model for every leader, regardless of age or gender, then we are not doing our job as a leader.
That's a really important point, Pastor Don, because what's important is women ministers are lacking that kind of intimate, private mentoring sessions where in those sessions you actually get to learn about what are they passionate about, what are they good at or not really good at. You know, those kind of personal information you glean from those kind of personal moments. Like you said, we probably need to rethink how we socialize or fellowship within our leadership culture, right? And I'm trying to learn golf just so that I can hang out with my but I'm really bad at it. But if you go bowling with me, you know, so, you know, kind of rethinking those kind of social activities. What are some of the things that we can be more inclusive rather than exclusive? You know, it's just a thought, but what you said was really right on. So thank you. Pastor Gene.
I think for me, it would be, we have 7 meetings of the presbytery a year that are strictly creative. The rules are we're not dealing with business, we're not dealing with minutes. We're going to talk about obstacles, problems, opportunities. And Sehi, I got to tell you, the most innovative, creative input we get is from our female leaders. In July, we had this rare visitation of God's Spirit in our presbytery meeting, and the Holy Spirit spoke to us. And we just had this time of debriefing, like, what just happened? And one of our female presbyters said, what happened in this room cannot stay here. We need to make this initiative our sectional tour. And so, you know, all these months we've been working and we've been asking every church to preach on the call of God or to give their testimony in the call of God. And I wasn't even back from tour yet, the 2 weeks. And we had already had 60 people come forward in their churches who are wanting to pursue the call of God, half of which are female. And this came from female leadership who are allowed to dream with us. I think the perspective, the ideas, the priorities they have are powerful. We need it. We need all the help we can get in the harvest today.
Yes, amen. And we need each other. Thank you so much for making your time to be at this conversation. And I just pray and hope that this will be a springboard for further conversation. This is not just one-off episode. It's not just one-off conversation as a resource that nobody's going to check it out. And I just pray that more people would engage this kind of tough conversation. We got to have it. But look, it can be done in such a wonderful and loving way. And I just love that we can model that. Pastor Gene, Pastor Don, I love you so much. Thank you for doing what you're doing and look forward to serving God with you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sei.
Such wonderful men of God, and I feel so empowered, and I hope you feel the same. Pastors, ministries, leaders, you guys are the world changers. And so as we wrap up our conversation today, I just want to share some books, and that during my studies, I came across many books, of course, but these books, oh my goodness, these are like my second Bible, right? So if you are male leaders who are wanting to learn how to champion women better, of course, talk with Pastor Gene, Pastor Don, or any men like them, district superintendents. By the way, you know, there are such busy men and they have to reschedule everything and they prioritize this conversation. I mean, that's intentional leadership. So you can do that too. By the way, I'm going to just go over a couple of books. I grabbed 5 books. This is not, you know, exhaustive, of course, but a few things. If you've never heard of this book, it's called Work With Me by Barbara Annis and John Gray. And she also wrote this other book called Gender Intelligence. And she wrote it with Keith Moran. And excellent book, and I've quoted these 2 books in my studies, but if you're wanting to learn about how can we best work side by side, these are the books that you want to go to. An excellent resource, okay? And then if you're a male leader, you know, like there are so many books on women in leadership from women's perspective. And, you know, that's all great, but I think sometimes the right people have to speak to the right people. So these 2 books are written by 2 incredible male leaders. And these are scholars, educators, and they both have military background. I mean, just talking about leadership, right? Gender inclusive leadership. So these 2 books, I strongly, strongly recommend. In fact, this book was given to me by my male mentor from a secular world, right? I have a mentor that is not in ministry, and he came to lunch one day, and we go on a regular lunch at the same place and same time. And then every time he comes with a new book and a notepad. I mean, I've never seen any male champion who champions women like that. I mean, and he's not even a minister. So he gave me this book, and it's like, I think you're going to like this book, and you can use it towards your study. Boy, I fell in love with this book. And so this is kind of like a similar kind of idea, but these are the conversation from male to male. So I think you're going to just absolutely love these books, okay? So that's that. And don't you sometimes wonder, oh, I wonder what's going on in the woman's mind, and I just want to think, I mean, we women think we want to read your mind too, but I know that it's probably the same thing for you as well. So here's a book. That's what she said. What men need to know and women need to tell them about working together. Let me tell you, women are not really good at self-promotion. We're not good at initiating conversation. Pastor Jean talked about, hey, initiate meeting with male leaders. We want to, we just don't know how to, right? We're so scared. So if you want to kind of look into, have a glimpse of what's going on in the women's world and their mind as leaders and who aspire to be in the higher leadership, this is such a great resource for you. But that's not exhaustive, and I hope that we can just pull up more resources. We're going to link those resources in our website so you can just take a look and grab more. If you have anything else, go ahead and feel free to share that. Well, thank you so much for joining this amazing conversation. I don't know about you, but I had a blast. Until every man and woman fulfills their ministerial call, let's remember we're better together.